Good morning, Year 10. It is the 15th of June 2020, and this lesson begins your learning for this week. 2 lessons to get uploaded this week. This one is today's little lesson, and there'll be another one up hopefully by tomorrow. I'm just putting it all together as we speak. But just a little to-do list for you. Some of you have already done this. If you have already done this, then you do not need to worry too much about this at all. In fact, you don't need to worry about that at all because you've already done it. The vast majority of you, though, do need to complete that. Explain what was important about the Harrying of the North question. Can you please submit that on Teams? That video is on Teams. It is on YouTube. There is no way that you can not get hold of the lesson on that, and you can do that quite straightforwardly. Also, the podcast is all on Teams. That is on Podbean, etc., etc. And answering those key questions about the rebellion of the Norman Earls, it is literally just so that I get an idea, we get an idea that you have engaged with the topic and that you've got some notes on it and you've listened to the podcast. Please can you submit this via Teams? So those 2 things need to be done before you even commence this lesson this morning, or whatever time of day you choose to look at this lesson. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about castles. Castles is one of the most fundamental topics when it comes to studying Norman England. It is one of those things that is the cornerstone of the Norman conquests. It is one of the most important things that the Normans bring over from France. Now today, what we're looking to do is we're looking to identify the key aspects of a Norman castle. What does a Norman castle look like? What are the different parts of a Norman castle? And we're looking to explain why Norman castles were important. I was contemplating getting you to write an exam answer. However, I've changed my mind. I've had a change of heart. I was visited by 3 ghosts in the night that told me that actually you've already got a deadline for Friday, the most of you. So I will leave it till then. I will forego this exam question just this once, and I'll just leave you to crack on with the content, because really that's the most important thing at this stage. But we will talk about changes and impacts of castles, which is really the key things to get your heads around. This is just an introduction to the topic. We're going to go into lots of depth and recap this later on. However, let's rock and roll with this then, shall we? Right, so you're probably thinking, when you're thinking of castles, you're thinking of great big stone walls, you're thinking of huge towers, you're thinking of, really impressive moats and defences. Well, you might not be thinking about anything at all, but however, that might be what you're thinking. But on the right-hand side, that is in fact your typical Norman castle. That is your normal Norman castle. On the right-hand side here, you can see this is your classic, what we call Motte-and-bailey castle. The Motte-and-bailey castle is exactly what it says on the tin. You've got a motte and you've got a bailey, and that forms a castle. So we need to establish some of the key parts of a Motte-and-bailey castle. So the motte is a mound of dirt. It's a mound of earth. It is not a hill as such. It is not the case that castles are built on hills. It is it's a man-made mound 9 times out of 10. And a loft is a keep. That is the strongest part of the castle. That is the stronghold. And that would be where the owner, often the proprietor of the castle would be. And he would oversee everything that's going on in the castle. He'd be in control of the castle. And that would be where your banquets are held and things like that. Of course, most people wouldn't be invited to that. It would be the event arranged, invite only by the Lord, of course. Now the bailey is here down at the bottom. You can see that this is where your main buildings would be. Your peasant huts, for example, your soldiers' barracks, your armory, your butchers, your bakers, etc., etc. So you can see that that is sort of the vast majority of it is actually the bailey. And the bailey is surrounded by a palisade wooden wall or fence. And the reason it's not built of stone, and the reason why it is built of wood is because, that's my dog shaking, sorry. The reason why it's built of wood is because it is cheap, it is easily accessible, and it can be constructed very, very quickly. The vast majority of Norman castles would be built of wood. It's not until later that they become actual stone structures of any substance, shall we say. All right, and that is why the vast majority of Norman castles do not exist to this day. There are sort of archaeological remains of castles, maybe sort of the earth might be slightly higher, slightly dense, if you will, because of the motte. But on the whole, the vast majority of castles do not exist from Norman times. Many castles, like Windsor Castle, was built after the Normans. Now, the basic principle of a castle is that it is a fortified area. It is a base, for lack of a better term. It is built for defence. It is built for stationing your troops at. Now, this whole idea of a fortified town, an area whereby it protects people and provides some form of military defence, is not new. In fact, the Romans came up with it, and it was developed further by the Anglo-Saxons. It was Alfred the Great. Shout out to Alfie in my group. Mr. Clark. It was actually built by Alfred the Great. He was the one that sort of came up with these burhs, these fortified towns, and that helped him. It really helped him to defeat the Vikings and drive them out of England not quite once and for all, but for his lifetime anyway. Now, the whole purpose of an Anglo-Saxon town or burhs, beg your pardon, is to defend. Its idea is somewhat different to a castle, which is sort of like an invading force, and it is dominating the people. However, you could argue that the Anglo-Saxon burhs, that helped Alfred the Great to consolidate, to unite the English people as one, to create England, shall we say. So it could be an example of two forms of domination. However, it's generally argued that castles are more for domination and the burhs are for defence. And it is a change. It is a change in purpose of Norman castles or fortified towns at this time. Anywho. Right, let's march on. So your key aspects of a Norman castle. So we've talked about the motte, which is here. That is the mound of earth. The keep is where the lord would be, and that's where sort of social events that he would hold. It would be he, unfortunately, ladies. He would hold in the keep. And you've got the bailey down here. That is where your key sort of buildings are. And the palisade fence around, we've already established. And it may be surrounded by something like a moat, which is a ditch. And it is all designed for defence. That is your basic, simple Motte-and-bailey castle that would form the vast majority of Norman castles in England. Right, so where would they be built? So you can see here, this is a map. This demonstrates where castles were built in the time of William the Conqueror. You can see the key areas here. So the English and Welsh border, right, we can see here lots and lots and lots of castles here. Why do you think that might be? Well, I'm hoping that your brain is sort of thinking, well, it's probably because the Welsh were troublesome and the Welsh rebelled. They did indeed. And the Welsh areas here were sort of ideal for attacking and defending. So you can see here that these are in part to defend against attack from the Welsh clans. However, there are other reasons. Another reason is probably, I'm guessing, because the Earl of Hereford was a Norman of Norman ancestry, and he was actually the first one to build castles long before William of Normandy actually came over and conquered. So you can see here, this is sort of Herefordshire around here, and there are lots and lots of different castles. The south coast, you can see, you can see that he built lots and lots of castles. William of Normandy did. And the reason why that is to defend it is to defend the south coast, of course. William feared invasions, particularly up the Thames. You can see he's got two little castles stationed on either side of the Thames. You can see, look. And he's there to defend against invasion. And the north, you can see there are castles in the north. Why? Well, it is to subdue the northern people following the Northern Rebellion. Similarly down in Exeter, you can see here, Exeter Castle was built following the rebellion in Exeter. So castles would be built to establish control to secure areas after a rebellion. So those are the key areas, and the geographical element, the map is good to illustrate to you where castles were built. Not many down in Cornwall, you notice. Why? Accessibility would be one, and things like that. Anyway, so that is where they would be constructed. Now it's over to you. So you have got key questions here that you need to answer. You can listen to the podcast, episode 7 of the podcast that is on Podbean, and the the MP3 file is on Teams, so you can download that, you can stream it, and you can listen to it. It covers a lot of the same ground that I've already covered, but it really goes into depth when it talks about the impacts. So why were castles built? The podcast tells you all about that in more depth. Where are castles located? Well, you can actually go back and you can tell me where they're located, but that is all in the podcast as well. Key parts of a castle, you can see, we've already been through that, but that is also in the podcast. And the key thing is the impact. So the military impact, the impact it had on armies, and the social impact, the impact that it had on people. So you need to pause this video, you need to go and source out that podcast, and you need to answer those questions. Get them as notes, so you've gone through the topic and you've crucially got that knowledge. So pause that video this video now, and I will check in with you in just a moment. Okay, right. So key thing with castles is change and impact. So I think some of the key changes we're getting here is, so we go from the burhs, which we talked about at the beginning, we go from burhs to castles, defense to domination. Shouldn't really pose that as a question mark, but often that is what is said. More castles are built as the Normans become more secure. So that map there, that is not William instantly building those castles. That takes years. It takes nearly 2 decades in fact, to construct anything like that. It is not part of some grand plan that William has. It is in part because of the landowners and the Norman lords that saw this as a way to secure areas and to dominate the area. So they changed from wood to permanent stone structures. You can see how as William became more established, that we went from those temporary wooden structures to more permanent stone structures. So places like the White Tower in London, Chepstow Castle, Colchester Castle, those kind of places are vital to securing the kingdom, and that is as William becomes more secure, that is when they become made of permanent stone. So you also got the change of relative freedom of peasants. So peasants were relatively free before the Normans came along. We talked about this in the podcast. And now they are very much restricted by the rule of the castellan or the lord that would control much of the area. Impact. So the military impact we've talked about, it provides safety for the limited number of Norman soldiers that were there post the conquest. Secured those newly conquered areas. So once trouble emerged, castles were able to act as a deterrent for future rebellion, and of course it patrolled difficult areas to prevent future trouble. You could station your troops on top of the wall, and they would be able to look out and sort of have their ears to the ground as such in the local areas, particularly as they were built on those communication routes, which meant that they could actually get to grips with potential rebellion or to prevent rebellion from fermenting. And of course that psychological impact is key as well. If you are a peasant, if you're a lowly peasant, not seen much of the world, and all of a sudden you see this great big structure that is built out of nowhere, it would be incredibly intimidating. It is something of a revolution in terms of Norman England and medieval England, the arrival of these castles. And these castles, as they go on, of course, they become more prevalent as time goes on. And of course, finally, the social impact. It symbolized the power of the lords. If the ability of a lord to build such a structure would symbolize the power and the domination of the lords. It would sort of reinforce that social hierarchy, which we will talk about later on. It caused disruption and destruction in towns. Economically, people couldn't go use many routes that they'd always had. And of course, homes would be destroyed to make way for castles. And of course, it restricted the freedom of the peasants, as is noted in the podcast. The right to roam as such, the ability of peasants to forage for food and things like that, that is taken away by the advent of castles. So changes and impact. If you want to get a summary table like that on your bit of paper or whatever you're using, or your book, that might be really, really helpful to you. I'm happy for you to do that. So your key points are here. This is to sum up our introduction to castles. We will come back to it again. So it is built as a response. They are built as a response to William's situation in England. Remember, he arrived. He needed to secure the kingdom as quickly and as efficiently and cheaply as possible. And it was a tactic used very effectively by French nobles, French dukes down on the continent. They were built by lords. Remember, this was not William himself. I know I mentioned William a lot. I sort of get lazy and talk about William. But really, this is a Norman phenomenon. This is sort of far bigger than just one person. They were built by lords to secure their areas, to demonstrate their power and authority. And they would be located in those difficult areas that the Normans needed to control, and strategically important areas. They had a profound military impact. It enabled William to secure the kingdom and to prevent further rebellion, and it had a profound social impact. It had a big impact on ordinary peasants around the kingdom. And I think the main thing, if you take away from this, I think it symbolized the permanence of the new Norman regime. It symbolized that the Normans were here to stay and they were not going anywhere, and it was something that the English people simply had to get used to. So that is your summary. That is your introduction to castles. Actually, with this and the podcast, it should be roughly around an hour or so. So make sure you've got those key questions down. Make sure you've got your key notes down. Lesson 2 will be on the system very, very shortly, and that will be looking at another aspect of actually when William dies, what happens next. So that is castles. This is a really, really important topic, so make sure you get to grips with it. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful, and send any work that you do to your teachers. Thanks for listening, and take care. See you very soon.